Hey, everybody. I hope you're enjoying the conference so far. My name is Stephan Delbos, and I am Director of Product Content at Muse. And I'm really happy to have the opportunity to share this talk with you today. It's called Drop the Docs, Get Back to What's Important: How to Create Product Documentation that Encourages User Disengagement. And this talk is really grounded in my own career and an evolution in my thinking about content and about measuring the success of content, what it means to create good content that really benefits the user. So, to inform this kind of journey, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my background, which really begins in journalism back in 2008. I worked for about 4 years as a business and culture journalist, and that's where I really started thinking about content in terms of the way that users interact with content, what it means to have good content on the web or in print. But in 2012, I made the leap over into the world of tech startups. And for about 8 years, I worked for a number of different startups, digital agencies, marketing agencies, companies large and small, in a variety of roles, ranging from marketing to documentation to UX writing, thought leadership posts, just about everything in between. And it was really in 2020 that I started to focus more exclusively on product content. And since 2021, I've been working at Muse as Director of Product Content, leading a team of really talented writers, editors, translators, content designers from around the world in our quest to revolutionize hospitality with our property management system. And when you look at my background, you see a pretty wide range of experience. Journalism would seem to have little to do with UX writing. Marketing would seem to have little to do with documentation. But what all of these roles have in common is that in my career, and I think more broadly in the world of content, the success of content has always been measured by engagement, how much the users engage with content. We want to get the users to the content as early and as often as possible, getting them to stay on the content as long as possible and to share it as widely as possible. And these traditional metrics have really ruled the roost when it comes to content, both in my own career and I know more broadly. And so this talk really is about a shift in my thinking, shifting from user engagement to user disengagement. And that's really what I want to focus on today, how in my own career, in my own thinking, I've made this transition and why I think it's important that you do it as well. The talk has 4 parts. The first is why many traditional content metrics don't work. Then we'll talk about why user disengagement should be your guiding principle, how to write documentation that's easier and faster to use, and how to measure the business impact of product documentation. So why many traditional content metrics don't work? Typically, content has been measured by how much it engages the user. So here from Contently, we have a really typical funnel of metrics for content success, starting with consumption, thinking about things like page views and visits, then engagement with bounce, PPV, time on site and time on page, then sharing metrics on social media, links, mentions, retweets, reposts, things like that. And then finally, conversions. When we get really to the goal, we meet the goal, our sales goals and our e-commerce goals. We know that consumption metrics are often considered vanity metrics because these really are more focused on company goals and kind of content team goals rather than the user. In the middle of the funnel, we get into SEO, and then at the bottom with conversions, we're getting to that bottom line that's so important for the business. All of these things have to do with engaging, hooking the user, grasping the user, drawing them in. Basically, there are 4 parts of this traditional content goal. We want to get the reader to the page. We want to keep the reader on the page. We want to get the reader to share the page. And then ultimately, we want to get the reader to buy something. And this is the way it's been done from time immemorial, right? Everybody's familiar with these. But we need to ask ourselves, what do users of product documentation really want? And this is a differentiating factor, I think, with documentation specifically, as opposed to other types of content. But also this question is more important than ever because we know that great documentation and great product content can be a key differentiator for products and companies. But in order to achieve that content that's so great that it's a differentiating factor for users, we need to be thinking about the users constantly. The users need to be at the heart of everything we do. We need to ask ourselves, what do users of product documentation really want? Do they want to spend a lot of time scrolling through your help articles and admiring the great writing style? Do they want to spend their free time becoming an expert on your product and learning everything they can about it? Not so much. What users really want is to complete an action and get back to their life, right? Especially when it comes to documentation, the reason the user is reading the documentation is because they've encountered a problem. There's something they cannot do, and they need to do it in order to complete their work successfully. So as documentarians, our first and last goal should always be to get the user back to their life as soon as possible. And that's disengagement as opposed to engagement. The idea of user disengagement comes out of the world of design. I've had the opportunity to work with some really talented visionary designers, and I've picked up this idea from them, and I'm applying it to documentation in a way that I think is very fruitful, and I hope you'll find it that way as well. The basic idea of user disengagement is to minimize users' interaction time with technology, enabling them to focus on more meaningful work and life, right? Just as I said, getting them out of the docs, dropping the docs, get back to what's important, the job at hand, or the interaction with the customer they may be having. User disengagement has had, in the world of design, has had many contributors, but we can talk about three who've been particularly influential for me. We've got Naoto Fukasawa in his great work, Design Dissolving in Behavior, from 2006, beginning this idea, this conversation about invisible technology, where the technology fades into the background and what's in the foreground is just the user's behavior, whatever they need to do. This is then pushed forward by Don Norman in his work, Designing for Disengagement, from 2014. And more recently, I've had the pleasure of working with Juan Hidalgo at Muse, a really talented and experienced designer who's really been revolutionizing my way of thinking about content and pushing this idea of user disengagement. It comes out of invisible design, which means creating products that blend seamlessly with the user's interaction and workflow. The experience fades into the background, enabling users to concentrate on their objectives without being distracted by technology. And when we think about product design, this makes perfect sense. We want the product itself to kind of fade away and just allow the user to do whatever they want to do without being distracted, right? But when we apply this to content, it might shake up some of our preconceived notions. We need to ask ourselves then, how should we think about documentation differently if we want to disengage, if we want users to disengage as quickly as possible? How is this going to change the way that we're writing content, the way that we're structuring and formatting content, and the way that we're measuring its success? It's about writing documentation that's easier and faster to use. When we apply the principles of user disengagement to documentation, we can boil it down to three really clear, simple, and direct rules. We want the documentation, number one, to be easy to find in the knowledge base or wherever it happens to be. We want, number two, the documentation to be fast to scan. We should have the documentation formatted and structured in a way that's going to allow the reader to scan it very quickly. And then finally, number three, we want the documentation to be purpose-driven, and that purpose needs to be connected directly to the user's purpose, because the purpose of documentation is to help the user achieve their purpose, their goal. So making the documentation easier to find. This is a challenge for anyone with a large or anything larger than a really kind of small knowledge base. As the bigger the knowledge base gets, the more articles you have in the knowledge base, the more difficult it's going to be for users to find. So we work with Salesforce as our CRM for the knowledge, or the CRM, as well as the content management system for our knowledge base. I'm sure many of you have experience working with that as well. And we ran into some real challenges as we have a knowledge base with approximately 1,200 help articles, and then those 1,200 are also not only in English, but in French, German, Dutch, and Spanish, our other core languages. And we also, for a time, had multiple departments contributing to the knowledge base. We have our product content team writing longer form documentation. And then we had our KCS team from customer support writing shorter how-to articles, FAQ articles, and things like that. And that alone, having different teams work on the documentation, presented some challenges because there were differing approaches to how we formatted the documentation, specifically in regards to tags and search terminology and summaries. So we worked really hard and very closely with a number of representatives from Salesforce to really get to the best practice when it comes to setting up the article and setting up the metadata on the article that's going to allow it to be found faster. Here we just have one example from our knowledge base looking up reservations. So we have set up an intelligent search that suggests, as you type in the search term, it suggests a number of different options that are related to your search term. We've also more recently been working with ChatGPT and looking at the potential there to use AI not only to suggest the best articles, but also then to put the suggestions together into a summary so that rather than just giving links to the best articles, it will actually give you the answer you're looking for as a summary of all the different relevant articles in the knowledge base. We've also audited the guides, the help articles in our knowledge base numerous times, tweaking the tags, tweaking the summaries. What we found is that having natural language in the summaries rather than synonyms based on the subject matter has really helped us. So we've been auditing, we've been getting input on best practices. We've also been measuring failed searches and looking really hard at what we can do to make sure that those failed searches go down continually and that we're addressing any knowledge gaps that might pop up. If we notice that a number of failed searches are coming from a similar subject matter or a similar topic, then we immediately dive in and do an audit and make sure there's not a knowledge gap, and we fill it if there is. This is a work in progress for us, but for me, user disengagement, number one, the knowledge base has to be easy to search. It has to give the right recommendations for articles, and your documents need to be easy to find. If you don't do that, you're already building up the time that needs to be spent, which is engagement rather than disengagement. Secondly, the articles need to be fast to scan. So here's another example from our knowledge base, and you can see some of the things that we've implemented with our content audits. You've got the tags up at the top here, front office operations, guest journey, etc. These can be clicked on to go to similar articles. We've also incorporated this navigational element at the top of each article. So we have a one-sentence summary and introduction. Then we have this navigational element, which is basically a table of contents saying, in this article, you can learn how to do this, this, and this. We make sure that these things at the top of the article are really purpose-driven, thinking about what the customer needs to do. We base this information both on looking at customer support cases, customer interviews, talking with the product teams, making sure that each of these is really closely related to some specific task. So we're using these links then to allow the users to jump down, to really just jump to the part of the article that they might need to use. So we can see create a custom link. That first hyperlink there leads us to the first subheading. And so we're allowing the users to scan the documents very fast. We're seeing that they're using the documents in a much more efficient way. And we're not making them read through an entire document to get to one specific piece of information at the bottom. This has been key for us on our journey to disengagement. And it's something we're constantly refining and iterating on when it comes to the formatting of the articles. Number 3, the articles need to be purpose-driven. So here we have an article adding mini bar items to a customer from the Muse app. We can see the tags, we can see the slightly longer introduction here, but lots of links to downloading the app, creating an additional service. And then at the bottom of this screenshot here, we have the navigational elements, and each of these are how-to, again, purpose-driven. When we look at an article like this about adding mini bar items to a customer, the real purpose here is about driving revenue for the property. And that's kind of the ultimate point of why someone would want to read this article. It's not simply just to add the item, but to add the item in order to drive that revenue. And so here we can see we're not getting tangled up in the inner workings of the product. The article has been written with the user's purpose in mind. And that is really what informs the writing, the structuring, the formatting, and then the search terms that we're using to allow the users to find these articles. So making sure that the documentation is purpose-driven, and when I say purpose, I mean fulfilling the purpose that the user is trying to accomplish. That is extremely important for user disengagement. So that's how to do it, but how to measure the impact of user disengagement and product documentation. Now, here's a graph that everybody's probably familiar with. This is how we're measuring some of the engagement on our content traditionally, talking about users with views on a monthly basis. And so we would traditionally be reporting on these numbers, trying to keep them up above a certain number, and really just kind of, again, thinking about what's often called vanity metrics. How do we measure whether we're doing a good job? Well, you know, if we're seeing steady or steadily growing numbers of users looking at the documentation, the release notes, then that must be a good thing. And that's a decent place to start, but we need to go further than that. And we need to go further than that, especially when we care about the user and disengagement. So what we've shifted into, rather than talking about the number of users and the number of views, although you can still, of course, see some of those here. We're looking at things like pages per session, average session duration, bounce rate. And here we have some numbers from year on year. Of course, we're seeing great growth, the number of users going up, page views going up, and things like that. But really, we would expect that to happen with the way that the user base has been growing. Something would really be going wrong to have the number of users going down year on year. But what we're really focusing on and excited to see is things like the number of pages per session going down 17% from 2.56 to 2.56 from 3.09 in the previous year. This means that when the users are getting to the Help Center, they're consuming fewer articles, which means that they're finding their solutions more quickly. They're not having to scan through a number of articles, and that's exactly what we want. The same thing with average session duration, going down from 4 minutes and 22 seconds to 3 minutes and 32 seconds. Now, if this went down to 0 or 10 seconds, we know we'd have a problem because that would be too fast for users to really get the answers they're looking for. But cutting off almost a minute is a really good sign because it tells us that the audits we've been doing to make the articles more scannable, easier to use, are really paying off, and that users are getting the answers faster. At the same time, the bounce rate, it's at 55.4%, which is up from 46.6%. And again, this is a good thing for us because it means that users are coming into the documentation, finding what they need, and then leaving. It's important when you're looking at these metrics and thinking about disengagement that these have to fall within a narrow kind of span. If the bounce rate, is going up to 100%, that's a problem. If the pages per session is going down to 0, or session duration is very, very low, that's indicative of people not finding the answers they need. But in shifting our thinking and looking at these metrics rather than the more traditional vanity metrics, alongside talking very closely and often with customer support and doing user interviews about the changes we've been making to the knowledge base, we see that we're really on the right path. Not only are the users disengaging more and more quickly, finding their answers more quickly, but their satisfaction is going up, and they've been very complimentary with the way that the knowledge base is much easier to navigate. So we're really thrilled about that. We're also looking at things like self-service score, article attach rate, and the point for us really is to drive customer support, self-service through the documentation. So we've been really closely monitoring this. What we're trying to get it to now is a self-service score of above 4, which is a Zendesk benchmark. And this really has to do with the number of unique visitors to the site, and then the number of those visitors to the knowledge base that ultimately create a case. And so when you think about the cost of each individual customer support case, it varies from company to company, but you're looking at, an average of €50 or more per case when it comes down to the time spent on solving that. So each case we can deflect is saving the company €50 or more, right? And when you start to talk about thousands of cases or even hundreds of cases per month, you start to really see the business impact of content in a great way. And the more users we can get knowing that the knowledge base is useful and easy to navigate, the more users we can get self-servicing, solving their own problems through the use of the help articles rather than going to customer support, the more effective we know the content is, and the more money we're saving for the company, but also we're delivering faster resolutions to customers, and we're allowing them to disengage, get back to their work. They don't need to call up customer support or send an email. They find the answer themselves and get back to it, and that's exactly what they want. So when we think about the key ideas of this talk, traditional engagement metrics are problematic because they're content-centric. They're not user-focused. They're focused on what the content team is doing, what the business is doing. They're not focused on what the user wants to do. That needs to change. When we think about user disengagement, both in terms of design, but more importantly for us in terms of content, what it does is aligns with user goals and desires. It's putting the user first, not the content first, not the company first. We're thinking about what does the user really want and need, and how can we deliver that through content. A key element is improving the searchability and the scannability for the documents and making sure that our documentation is always purpose-driven, and that purpose is the user's purpose. Finally, when it comes to measuring success, we want to be focusing less on the number of users and more on things like pages per session, bounce rate, self-service score, attach rate in customer support. And in that way, content becomes a more unified part of the business that's closely aligned with customer support. Ultimately, it's going to be closely aligned with sales, with all of those customer-facing teams, because the content is putting the customer first. The content is thinking about disengagement rather than engagement. The content is purpose-driven and is going to have a massive impact on the business and on the user. So let's write docs that are focused on user outcomes, not the inner workings of the product or the company. Let's stop getting wrapped up in the technical aspects of how amazing our products are, and they are amazing, and we love them, and we love our documentation, but we need to put the user first. Focus on user outcomes. Focus on what the user is trying to do. Focus on getting the user out of the docs and back into the real world as soon as possible. Thank you very much for your attention. Much appreciated. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye-bye.
Thank you for your talk. I think it was great. Again, it was really like provocative with the idea of disengagement. And I think a lot of what we're going to talk about is kind of like fighting the traditional idea that there should be engagement and like metrics and what to do versus everything that you introduced. So it's probably going to be a theme.
Cool.
And so our first question is, and I'm curious if your journalism background will influence this, is how do you think continuous user engagement on social media has impacted documentation engagement?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and there's tons of really thought-provoking questions there in the chat, so I'll try to keep up. I think it really depends in terms of social media. One on the type of company that you're working for and the type of customers you have. I think those really determine the type of expectations that people have. I think, I worked at one point for a startup that was specializing in a software for digital customer support. And the expectations that people have now that they can, just reach out on Twitter to Delta, and get an immediate response about their delayed flight or something has really changed, I think, customers' expectations of what customer support should be and like how engaged a brand should be. I think when you're talking about software companies with users, that are using your product on a daily basis, the expectations might be a little bit different. And I think it's also really important for the company to set those expectations. Like, for example, we don't have a massive presence on social media, and we don't really do any kind of social media like customer support. And so we've worked hard to kind of funnel users into a particular lane when it comes to customer support. So, hopefully that kind of manages their expectations a bit. But I do think that social media, especially for customer support, has changed the game in terms of what people expect to get, like the quick engagement and the kind of constant engagement from companies. So there might be a little bit of reorientation or re-education that needs to happen depending on the customer group.
Absolutely. And I think what you said about like, it depends on what kind of software you're building, are you B2B, are you B2C? I think those are completely different funnels of engagement versus are you building a developer tool? Like all of that kind of influences like how engaged your audience is in a social media context, and kind of like setting those boundaries. Sounds like what you're kind of saying is like making sure that internally you have that defined, and then whether or not you want to communicate that.
Absolutely. Yeah. It needs to be strategic.
Exactly. Perfect. And then we're going to pivot a little to how would you start with this disengagement if you're on a small team, like imagine 1 or 2 writers?
Yeah. So I've had the opportunity to grow my team now over the past 2.5 years or so. There were 2 writers when I started, and now we have about 15. By the end of the year, we'll have 16 people on the team.
Oh, wow.
So I think,
nice.
And we were able to do that because we were able to show the business value of the content. So I think with a small team, assuming that the team wants to grow, it becomes really more important to speak the language of, leadership and business stakeholders. So what I would do first and foremost with a small team is, assuming there's a customer support team, is to work really closely with them. To sit down with customer support and understand, what their needs are and through them what the needs of the users are. I think, I've been in situations where leadership believes, okay, we need to build out as many help articles as possible. We want to publish 1,000, help articles by the end of the year. And that's just from a user's standpoint is just not really valuable. So
more things to sift through.
It's harder to find. Yeah, exactly right. So I think a challenge that most content teams face is showing the impact and the value. And I think number one for me is case deflection, is getting customer support agents to use the articles when they're closing cases. And that's immediately going to start a different conversation about the actual needs of customer support and what content can do to fill that need.
Oh, absolutely. As a solo person right now, I can totally advocate for like getting on in good graces with people like support, because then also they'll advocate for you and why your job is helping them and important. And it all kind of circles back. And it's nice to have, yeah. And it's also nice to have a source of truth. Like, is it the documentation? Is it the help center? Depending on what you have available. I think that's really great. And then since we're talking about, other people, our jobs like have to do with managing expectations of other people. How do you put guardrails on to make sure that this like disengagement rate is a proxy of quality and not like the measure of quality itself? Like, how do you kind of like finagle that with your manager?
Yeah. I mean, I've been really lucky in the sense that this idea of disengagement is something that's really resonated throughout the whole company. And so there's been, kind of immediate buy-in from that idea. But we also look, as you can kind of see in the talk, we're looking at really a number of different qualitative and quantitative metrics. We haven't totally ditched page views in terms of like, okay, are we still growing in the direction that we want to grow? And obviously, as I said, as you're getting more customers, you want to see more viewers. That just kind of goes without saying. But I think, trying to take a holistic approach and report on as many different data points as possible, and also talking with customers, which is, it seems like a no-brainer, but in my experience, even with really customer-centric companies, it can be harder than you would expect to actually set up a customer interview, really learn about how people are using the product and using the content. And I think if content teams can do that, it's a huge win, because not every team in the company is doing that. And it's like everybody thinks they know the customer. They think they know what the user's needs are. But, in our case, we work with hotels. So going to a hotel, sitting behind the front desk and seeing how people actually use the system, sometimes they're doing things in an unexpected way, utilizing workarounds, all sorts of hacks and things that, you never really understand until you get out into the field. So I think that combination of, disengagement should be part of the picture, part of the reporting. I wouldn't, especially at the beginning, with maybe a skeptical manager, I wouldn't totally throw away all of those traditional content metrics, because that's what, people understand. But I think having that holistic and kind of multifaceted approach to reporting, then staying as close as possible to the customer and to customer support, it's a really great combination.
Absolutely. And I think it ties back to our talk from Katie yesterday about, engaging with UX teams and design teams if you have them available, because they might have those customer calls and recordings that you can watch, even if you're not directly part of it. And so, okay, final question, last minute. Can you explain some of the improvements you made to the search functionality regarding like search terms based on the presence in the documentation, or what would be maybe your top search improvement tips for our audience?
Yeah. There's some good questions about the search, and I'll get back to answering everybody here in the short while here in the chat. But the search has been a journey of discovery. So we're currently using the kind of out of the box Salesforce search, which even Salesforce themselves, they don't use their own search as a company.
Really?
So we've faced some challenges, let's say, with the Salesforce search, and we've looked at a few other really impressive tools. We've been looking at Zoom In lately. There's one called Search Unify, which is really great, a kind of federated search, which would allow us to surface on the Help Center, not just the articles, but, release notes, API docs, to bring in everything into one place. But we've worked really closely with folks from Salesforce in terms of establishing best practices for, tags and what should go in the summaries and things like that. But I would say my number one top tip would be to use the language of the customers. So on many, many occasions, we've found that, we've written these guides. In some cases, we've even, come up with names for products and features. And then we have a community, where people can request features and talk about the product and things. And we've often found that, we've created this whole idea of what something should be called, but users are calling it something totally different. And so, we also face, and I think this is common, if you're working in an industry where there's a lot of legacy providers for whatever product you're making, you're often getting people who've used a different product for 20 years, and they might not,
Absolutely.
they don't call it bills, they call it something else. So you've got to be really kind of aware of the language that actual users are employing, whether that is, just a slang or a shortcut or something different to talk about something, or maybe it's terminology from a competitor. So, we've kind of gone in and augmented the search terms, not only with the terms that we use, but also terms that competitors use. And then
That's smart,
definitely
yeah.
making sure that, we're using the language of the user.
Oh, absolutely. Especially because documentation tends to be a point of like evaluation for a product. Do we want to use it? I see that in my analytics of like people who are clearly creeping around to decide if they want to, pay money to use the thing that we're building. So I think that's great to be able to kind of cater to that audience and know, okay, they might search for this. Let's serve them our version of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then that is all the time we have for this Q&A, but where can people find you? Because we had so many questions.
Yeah. I'll probably pop this in there, but I'm on LinkedIn. Always happy to connect. I'm on Twitter. The handle's proper prodcon. And yeah, drop me a line. I'd be happy to chat more.